Tonight, we confront a question few ever imagined would matter. Can a landlocked nation, mocked for its dust, its droughts, its distance from the sea, truly feed itself from its own waters? This August in Burkina Faso, something quiet, yet historic, unfolded. Nets tightened in the dark, reservoirs rippled, and from the depths, silver bodies surged upward. Baskets rose heavy, shimmering with life. For the very first time, this nation harvested food from floating cages built not by outsiders, but by its own hands. Officials confirmed it. 5 tons of fish. But here is the greater question. Was this simply a harvest, or was it the first shot in a new kind of revolution? For decades, the world told Burkina Faso, no. No coast, no ships, no hope. But what happens when a people refuse to live by that script? When grandmothers, soldiers, and students lock arms at midnight to guard fragile cages in the water? When a platoon no longer waits for cargo from foreign harbors, but instead dines on fish raised in their own reservoirs? If food becomes a weapon of independence, who stands to lose their grip? Traders who built fortunes on imports? Foreign powers that, critics argue, once used hunger as leverage? Aid groups whose very relevance depended on keeping nations in perpetual need? Analysts now ask, how far might those interests go to resist change? Here's the twist. This was no miracle. It was a method. Cages, fingerlings, feed mills, cold storage, created not in Paris, not in Washington, but in the villages of Burkina Faso itself. Could this become a blueprint for Africa's wider self-reliance? Could dependency break quietly, not with fire and slogans, but with nets and fish? President Ibrahim Traoré has already named it a blue revolution. Yet questions linger. Can a single landlocked nation truly transform its reservoirs into fortresses of survival? Will the promise of 100,000 tons of fish each year remain only words, or become a shield strong enough to withstand outside pressure? Because this story at its core is not only about fish, it is about dignity, about sovereignty, about the dangerous possibility that food might one day topple fear. For decades, Burkina Faso's name carried the weight of dust, drought, and dependence. In 2018, the nation's aquaculture output barely touched 400 tons, not even enough to feed one city for a single month. Fish was a rare luxury, imported frozen from distant coasts. And each fillet carried a reminder: your food does not belong to you. And hunger, of course, is never just hunger. A sudden spike in prices can weaken entire villages. Delayed aid deliveries can bend governments to foreign demands. Loans arrive with conditions that reach far beyond the dinner table. In the Sahel, food insecurity has been more than an economic problem. It has been a lever of power, and it has been pulled again and again. But 6 months ago, something shifted. A group of farmers, students, and engineers quietly decided they had read that story for the last time. Without cameras, without applause, they lowered the first cages into a reservoir east of Ouagadougou. No parades, no speeches. Just nets, fingerlings, and a whispered vow among themselves: we will feed ourselves. The beginning was hard. Storms shredded nets that had to be stitched by hand. Feed supplies collapsed, forcing caretakers to grind local sorghum and maize to keep fingerlings alive. Traders, sensing a threat, spread rumors. The water would spoil. The cages would sink, the fish would rot. And still, worse came. Some nights, knives slashed through nylon, acts of quiet sabotage, subtle warnings that not everyone wanted this experiment to succeed. Yet the villagers endured. They guarded those cages as if protecting treasure. And when the baskets came up heavy this August, the world finally took notice. Now, across West Africa, all eyes are on Burkina Faso. Some see only a small victory. Others see the fragile beginning of a movement that could ripple outward, changing how nations feed themselves and how they stand against outside pressure. Burkina Faso's harvest is just one moment, but the stakes reach far beyond the reservoir. Because the truth is clear, whether this becomes a revolution or remains a modest success, it has already given a people something they were told they could never have: belief. Belief that the waters within their own borders may finally, at last, feed their own. They began with almost nothing. Just scraps of feed, passed between neighbors, and a fragile trust that deepened week after week. Hunger had already carved its lesson into them: the cost of dependency. They knew what it meant when food was priced beyond the reach of the poor. They knew the silence of marketplaces when cargo ships failed to arrive. And so they waited, and they worked, believing that, if the cages could hold, then one day the harvest would rise louder than any rumor. By August 2025, that day arrived. At dawn, over a cooling reservoir, nets pulled tight, and the water erupted, boiling with silver bodies. The first harvest came in, 5 tons. To outsiders, a small figure. But to Burkina Faso, it was nothing. Less than a turning point. Officials recorded the numbers. Journalists began to circle. Yet the most powerful testimony wasn't written in ledgers or captured in headlines. It came from the people standing on the shore. Among them, Mayam, a grandmother raising 2 grandsons while her son served in the army. For 4 long years, fish had been rare, bought frozen, always expensive, always uncertain. But that morning, a cooperative worker placed a fresh basket into her hands. No cargo ship, no foreign supplier, just tilapia, raised in her own district. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered, "This is ours. Not just the fish, the dignity." That word spread like wildfire, dignity. It captured what no statistic ever could. Because this was not just about protein. This was about ownership, about breaking a cycle where hunger itself had been wielded as leverage. The scene became a living symbol. Elders clutching fish born in their own waters. Children laughing as they struggled to lift baskets too heavy for their arms. Soldiers, in dusty boots, sharing rations not from aid, but from their own reservoirs. Pictures of that harvest traveled far beyond the villages, and suddenly what many had dismissed as a fragile experiment began to look like the spark of something far greater. Soon after, the government confirmed it. Over 100 cage units were already in operation, each managed by a cooperative. The goal was declared openly: 100,000 tons of fish every year. Enough to feed school children, supply the army, and stock family tables, without leaning on imports. For perspective, Burkina Faso produced just 400 tons in 2018. The new target represented a 250-fold leap. The numbers mattered, yes, but the voices on the ground carried more. Across markets and households, a phrase began to echo: "Our water, our food, our freedom." It appeared painted on rocks near reservoirs, scrawled on walls, and whispered in kitchens. This was no longer only an agricultural project. It had become a statement of defiance. And for those who had long doubted, the harvest demanded a reckoning. If a landlocked nation, overlooked for decades, could pull food from its own reservoirs, what else might be possible? If cages could turn one dam into a farm, what could 1,000 reservoirs become? And if dependency could be broken, what power would remain for those who once profited from it? The story of Burkina Faso's Blue Revolution did not begin with speeches or foreign aid packages. It began with villagers, mending nets by hand, guarding cages through storms, grinding feed from whatever grains they had. Ordinary people who refused to give up. 6 months later, their perseverance culminated in a harvest that may yet redefine what sovereignty looks like in the 21st century. And so, when we look ahead, we return to that shoreline, to the nets pulled tight, to the silver bodies thrashing in the dawn, to the grandmother holding her basket and whispering, "This is ours." That quiet, seismic moment marked the true beginning of Burkina Faso's Blue Revolution. But if this harvest was only the beginning, what comes next? Stay with us. Because, in the next chapter, we uncover how a single basket of fish rose from a village miracle to the level of national policy, and why that shift unsettles those who once profited from hunger. What started as a handful of cages, stitched together by farmers and students, has now been elevated to the stage of state strategy. Hours after the first nets came up in August, officials confirmed what many had already suspected. The experiment was no longer an experiment. It was a model. Scaled, expanded, made national. More than 100 cage units were already in place, each one led by local cooperatives. The government's vision was clear: 100,000 tons of fish every year. Compared to just 400 tons in 2018, this was not growth. It was transformation. And it wasn't only promises. Engineers were dispatched to design national hatcheries capable of producing millions of fry, laying the foundation for a future where food security might no longer rest on imports, but on Burkina Faso's own waters. The vision was bold, and the promise unmistakable. Burkina Faso would no longer depend on foreign suppliers for the very seeds of its food chain. For the first time, blueprints were approved for feed mills fueled entirely by local crops: maize, sorghum, and byproducts. Once written off as waste, cold storage hubs, ice plants, and transport links were drawn on maps, connecting small rural cages to sprawling urban markets. The chain was being rebuilt step by step, from hatchery to dinner plate, anchored firmly within the nation's own borders. Then came the moment that captured a movement. Under the blazing sun in Ouagadougou, President Ibrahim Traoré stood before the cameras. His tone was calm, but his words cut with precision. "If others control the seas," he declared, "Burkina will control its waters." The weight of those words hung heavy. For decades, the nation's food supply had been dictated from beyond its borders. Cargo ships decided when fish would dock. Exporters dictated the price. Aid donors set the terms. But now, this landlocked nation was saying enough. For those gathered, the announcement was not just about economics. It was about recognition. Recognition of farmers who stayed awake through long nights, guarding fragile cages against sabotage. Recognition of mothers who ground maize into makeshift fish feed when foreign supply chains collapsed. Recognition of villages that endured mockery and setbacks, refusing to let failure define them. When the government unveiled what it called the Blue Revolution, the statistics mattered. But the true electricity in the air came from pride. Teachers compared the moment to the first flicker of light bulbs in their homes. Soldiers described it as a new kind of defense, one that fortified both body and spirit. In bustling markets, women lifted baskets of fresh fish and declared, "We do not need frozen imports anymore." But as every revolution writes its story, resistance stirs in the shadows. Import traders, whose fortunes were built on frozen shipments, saw their warehouses pile up with unsold stock. Some reportedly spread whispers of contamination, warning that disease would soon sweep through local cages. Others muttered of corruption, hinting that cooperatives were nothing more than political theater. The response was swift. Security patrols were dispatched to reservoirs. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder with civilians, guarding the fragile nets. Officials reframed the picture. These cages, they said, were not only farms, they were shields. Every harvest was cast as a weapon against dependency. Along the shorelines, volunteers painted words on stones, simple but unshakable. Our water, our food, our freedom. The symbolism was clear. This was no longer just aquaculture. It was sovereignty. And yet, beneath the optimism, the stakes climbed higher. Scaling up to 100,000 tons of fish would demand discipline, coordination, and transparency. Who would handle contracts for fingerlings and feed? How would the surface of dams be divided fairly? Which cooperatives would be granted the first rights? Without clear rules, unity could fracture into conflict. For the moment, however, the tide of public opinion was undeniable. Citizens had tasted the first harvest of self-reliance, and they wanted more. What began as an experiment had become government policy. What began as policy was crystallizing into doctrine. From remote reservoir to the capital's boulevards, from rumor to reality, the Blue Revolution was now fact. But looming over it all is the question of endurance. How long can the government hold this course, when both foreign and domestic forces may work to drag it back? If food is power, then every ton harvested tips the balance. And history has shown that every shift in power brings resistance. The blueprint is drawn, the stakes are rising, and the struggle is only beginning. Now, the story leaves the corridors of government and returns to the true battleground. The markets, the households, the daily lives where revolutions either fade or endure. Policies may light the spark, but people decide if the flame survives. Across Burkina Faso, the first harvest has already unleashed scenes not seen in generations. In a market near the Ziga Dam, a mother of four, Fatou, lifted a fresh tilapia and said with quiet force, "For the first time, I can buy fish that came from here, not frozen, not imported. Here." Her words carried not just relief, but defiance. She was no longer captive to prices dictated by ships in foreign harbors. In another town, a vendor named Awa, once dependent on frozen mackerel, now stood behind a stall filled with local catch. Her customers ranged from soldiers in dusty boots, to elders on bicycles, to children clutching small coins. The fish was fresher, the price lower, and the profits stayed in the community. Smiling, she weighed a basket and said, "This is not charity. This is breathing room." Such scenes resonated deeply. Elders compared the moment to the day electricity first illuminated their villages, a symbol that the future could be different, that tomorrow could be shaped by their own hands. And so, as this blue revolution unfolds, its meaning grows sharper. For Burkina Faso, this is about more than food. It is about sovereignty, resilience, and the fight for independence in a shifting world. In classrooms across Burkina Faso, teachers told their students, Remember this moment. This is history. This is what independence looks like when it's born from your own hands. On military outposts, soldiers cheered, because for the first time in years their rations no longer depended on foreign aid convoys. And in small villages, where families had once survived on little more than starch, laughter returned to dinner tables, laughter rising over plates where fresh fish finally sat within reach. But every revolution, even one of food and dignity, draws its own resistance. The traders who had grown wealthy on imports suddenly found themselves cornered, their warehouses stacked with frozen stock that no one wanted. And then came the whispers. Rumors spread that the cages would poison the reservoirs, that disease was inevitable, that contamination was only a matter of time. Those rumors traveled, faster than the truth itself, and when words failed, sabotage followed. Nets slashed in the darkness, fingerlings stolen, stones hurled into cages, each act small, but each carrying the same chilling message. Not everyone wanted this movement to succeed. The government's answer was not only security, but symbolism. Soldiers were dispatched to guard the cages, but they did not stand alone. Villagers volunteered to watch beside them. At one reservoir, young men painted 3 words on the shoreline rocks: our water, our food, our freedom. The sight became a powerful image in itself. Civilians and soldiers sharing boats, radios, and patrols. Side by side, they turned protection into a message. This is not just a project. This is a movement. The nation lived in a rare tension, celebration, shadowed by unease. Mothers wept as they cooked fish for their children for the first time in years. Elders spoke softly of dignity restored, but in the corners of marketplaces, in hushed conversations, fear lingered. Would the cages survive the next storm? Would saboteurs strike again? Would the traders, the middlemen, and the foreign suppliers who had long profited from dependency find new ways to strike back? For now, the people's answer was resilience. Villagers patrolled at night. Students volunteered to guard nets. Women organized into cooperatives, smoking and processing fish to sell in markets. A quiet determination spread across the land. Together, with a growing belief that this time the change could not be undone. And that belief itself became dangerous, because in a nation long mocked, dismissed, and ignored, there is nothing more powerful than citizens who begin to believe their own work matters, that they can feed their children with their own waters, that they no longer need permission to survive. This, more than any number or statistic, is the heartbeat of Burkina Faso's so-called Blue Revolution. A story not just about food, but about dignity. Not just about fish, but about freedom. From classrooms to marketplaces, from grandmothers to soldiers, the ripple effects are reshaping daily life. But every step forward carries new threats. And so the question hangs in the air. What would you do to defend your food, your family, your freedom? Online, those who believe Africa's time has arrived are making their voices heard, writing Amen in the comments so the world knows they are watching. What began as quiet harvests in one reservoir has now spilled into something far larger, a regional conversation and an international calculation. In Mali and Niger, governments quietly dispatched study teams. Could their own neglected reservoirs become engines of food and stability? In Nigeria, youth groups pushed the story viral with a single phrase: "Now water feeds." And in Bamako and Niamey, policy papers began circulating, asking whether a blue revolution could hold fragile societies together against hunger, against migration, against despair. Across West Africa, one message grew louder. If Burkina Faso can do it, so can we. That possibility alone was enough to unsettle the balance of power. In Europe, the tone shifted. Commentators warned that if the model spread, exporters who had long dominated West African markets could see profits collapse. Editorials described the fish cages as an unlikely experiment, one with the power to rewrite Africa's food future. And that word, rewrite, carried weight. For decades, aid programs and trade routes had written the script. Now, for the first time, Burkina Faso was holding the pen. In Asia, the reaction was almost celebratory. Analysts in Beijing, Delhi, and Jakarta praised the project as proof of local self-reliance. Newspapers hailed it as a living example of how African nations might leapfrog dependency and design their own food chains. Development experts went further, calling it a model that could stretch across the Sahel, from Chad to Sudan. And then there was Washington. For the United States, long one of the largest donors in the region, the revolution posed both promise and dilemma. On one hand, a stable, self-sufficient Burkina Faso fits American interests perfectly. Fewer hunger crises, less forced migration, fewer opportunities for extremist groups to recruit, and lower pressure on aid budgets. But a Burkina Faso that no longer relies on U.S. food programs also means one less lever of influence. Policy debates in Washington reportedly grew sharper. Some voices urged support, training labs, cold chain financing, infrastructure, all framed as genuine partnership rather than control. Others cautioned that too much success might pull Burkina Faso closer to rival powers. Nations eager to back an Africa building strength on its own terms. And so the story of a few cages in a quiet reservoir has become something larger. A test of resilience, a regional model, a global flashpoint. Whether this blue revolution reshapes food security across West Africa or buckles under the weight of politics, sabotage, and foreign pressure, remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. The people of Burkina Faso are no longer waiting for others to write their story. They are writing it themselves. And the world is watching. The question is as old as the Cold War itself. When does power make a partner? And when does it turn that partner into a rival? In Ouagadougou, the words of President Ibrahim Traoré rang like a challenge across the continent. If others control the seas, Burkina Faso will control its waters. For neighbors, it was a rallying cry. For distant capitals, it sounded like defiance. And soon the world's media seized the moment. European broadcasters asked, "What happens when frozen imports are no longer needed?" Analysts in Asia wondered, how fast could this model spread? In the United States, the question was blunt. Is this a pivot away from donor dependence? But in Africa's marketplaces, the question was more personal, more immediate. When will it be our turn? The symbolism carried as much weight as the fish themselves. A country once dismissed as too poor, too landlocked, too dependent, had reshaped its own destiny. And in doing so, it forced friends and rivals alike to redraw their place in Africa's unfolding future. Yet recognition always cuts both ways. Exporters watching their markets shrink are unlikely to step aside quietly. Aid groups built on the economics of crisis will lobby to maintain their role. And foreign governments, losing leverage they once took for granted, will search for new pressure points. For Burkina Faso, the harvest was a triumph. But the ripples it set in motion may be every bit as dangerous as the storms that came before. This is the Blue Revolution, and like every revolution, it carries two faces: opportunity and risk. On the side of opportunity, the scale is staggering. Once reliant on imports for its protein, Burkina Faso is now designing a food system rooted in its own waters. The potential is vast, more than 1,000 reservoirs across the nation, each capable of hosting dozens of fish cages. A single cage can feed a school, supply a platoon, sustain an entire family. Multiply that by hundreds, then thousands, and the outcome is not just meals, it's momentum. The numbers reveal the story. From 400 tons of aquaculture in 2018 to a national target of 100,000 tons every year. Enough fish to fill school lunch programs nationwide. Enough to guarantee rations for soldiers beyond the reach of any foreign supplier. Enough to put affordable protein on the tables of villages where meat is rare and malnutrition is common. But the deeper impact lies in the social shift now taking shape. In classrooms, teachers say steady lunches are keeping children in school. In clinics, doctors anticipate fewer cases of stunted growth. And in villages, young men who once saw their only future abroad are now finding work in hatcheries, feed mills, cold storage, and distribution. One cooperative alone can employ 20 to 30 people. Expanded across the nation, that becomes not just a project, but a quiet engine of jobs, grounded in production, not paperwork. And women are stepping forward too, smoking, drying, processing, selling, roles that create year-round income where survival once hinged on seasonal farming. Local feed mills turn surplus maize into pellets, transforming waste into value. Cold rooms and ice plants drive demand for electricians, mechanics, and drivers. Every link keeps wealth inside the country. Every link forges another chain of sovereignty. But opportunity never walks alone. The risks are already visible. Water is contested. Dams provide irrigation, energy, and now aquaculture. Who decides which cooperative gets space? Who sets the rules when fish waste drifts toward villages? Drinking supply? Without transparent permits and clear scientific limits, victories could unravel into bitter disputes. Contracts invite power struggles. Hatchery fingerlings, feed production, cold chain logistics. Each is lucrative. If corruption seeps in, if tenders are manipulated, if cooperatives become instruments of patronage, trust will fracture long before courts intervene. The very social license that fuels this project could collapse. And then there is nature's warning. Overstocking. Cages risks disease. Low-quality feed strips oxygen from the water, suffocating fish. Poor waste management sparks algae blooms that choke ponds and poison people. The solution, analysts argue, lies not in retreat but in regulation. Carrying capacity caps per hectare. Mandatory fallow cycles. Independent labs testing water quality. Transparent reporting of fish mortality. Public dashboards that turn whispers of contamination into hard data. Without such measures, rumor could spread faster than facts, threatening the project's survival. Security, too, is a delicate axis. A single knife in a cage net under cover of darkness can erase months of work. Patrols matter, but ownership matters more. When villagers guard the cages because their children's meals depend on them, sabotage becomes a costly choice. When soldiers and civilians share radio nets and guard posts, a dam becomes more than concrete. It becomes a fortress of collective survival. And beyond fish, there is the politics of food itself. For decades, food insecurity pulled in donors, NGOs, and foreign contractors. But Burkina Faso's Blue Revolution is redrawing the lines. Will it stand as a model of self-reliance? Or will it draw resistance from those with the most to lose? That remains an open question. What is clear is this: every revolution carries two faces, the promise of opportunity and the shadow of risk. Burkina Faso's Blue Revolution is no different. Some leaders in Burkina Faso have delivered real progress. Others, critics say, built their reputations by managing permanent crisis. But today, something larger is unfolding. Something that could redefine the future. A Burkina Faso that feeds itself is not just a headline. It is a shift in power. It gives the government the ability to decide, with steadier hands, when to say yes and when to say no. This reset will be described in different ways. To some it is independence, to others, defiance. Yet beneath the optimism, the hard questions remain. Will subsidies distort the market? Could rapid expansion move faster than safeguards? Should exports be encouraged, or should surplus be saved for leaner seasons? These are not technical details. They are the foundation of a food future. And the answers must not only be written in Ouagadougou, but in villages where fishing nets are lowered into the water every day. For the United States and other global powers, the stakes are even sharper. A stable West African nation can reinforce global security. But a Burkina Faso that produces its own food also gains the freedom to speak with its own voice. The question is this: will the world welcome that voice, or attempt to quiet it? The answer may shape not just Burkina Faso's destiny, but Africa's position in a century where food security is as strategic as oil. And so we return to the shoreline once more. Nets falling into still waters, children balancing baskets, soldiers standing watch, a grandmother whispering dignity into her palms. This is where opportunity collides with risk. Not in conference halls, not in policy papers, but in the rhythm of daily life. On one side, hope. On the other, danger. If you believe Africa can turn risk into strength, type "Africa can do it" in the comments below. Let the world know where you stand. That concludes today's report. But the story of Burkina Faso's Blue Revolution is far from over. What began with a few simple cages dropped into a quiet reservoir has grown into something far greater, a movement that challenges hunger itself and shakes the balance of power. For decades, Burkina Faso was told what it could not do. Too dry, too poor, too dependent, told to wait for ships, for donors, for promises made abroad. But in August 2005, the people chose a different ending. They pulled 5 tons of fish from their own waters, and in that moment, they whispered a single word that changed everything: dignity. From there, the story rippled outward, into markets where mothers bought local fish for the first time, into schools where teachers reminded children they were living through history, into barracks where soldiers stood taller, knowing their rations came from home. It spread across borders, to Mali, Niger, and Nigeria, where leaders sent delegations to learn, to Europe, where exporters grew uneasy, to Asia, where analysts praised self-reliance, and to Washington, where policymakers reportedly debated, do we welcome this rise or resist it? The meaning was profound. a nation long dismissed had done the impossible. A landlocked country without a coastline had fed itself from water, and with that achievement came questions far bigger than fish, bigger than food. What happens when a people stop waiting for charity and begin building their own future? What happens when dependency can no longer be used as leverage? What happens when dignity, once restored, spreads like wildfire? These are not abstract questions. They are as real as nets stretched across reservoirs tonight, as urgent as children laughing under the weight of baskets they can barely carry, as powerful as words carved on stones by the water's edge. Our water, our food, our freedom. But revolutions never go unchallenged. Traders who thrived on imports may push back. Organizations built on permanent crisis may whisper doubt. Foreign powers who once held leverage may search for new pressure points. The road ahead will not be smooth. It will be steep, contested, and uncertain. Yet history suggests something powerful. Dignity, once claimed, is not easily taken away. Burkina Faso has shown that sovereignty does not begin with guns or with gold. It begins with something far simpler. The act of feeding your children with food from your own hands. That is why this story matters far beyond its borders. Because if one nation can rise, others can follow. If one can become a fortress of survival, others can too. If one grandmother can whisper, "This is ours," then one day an entire continent may declare, "This is Africa's time." So as we close, the questions remain. Will you see Captain Ibrahim Traoré as the hope of a rising Africa, or as a threat to an old order collapsing too quickly? Will you regard the Blue Revolution as a shield of independence, or dismiss it as a fragile experiment? And will you stand with those who believe food can be more powerful than weapons? If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Say it with us. Africa bows to no one. If your heart beats for Africa's freedom, subscribe and stand with us. And one last word. Thank you. Thank you for being here, for watching, for carrying this message forward. Because stories like this survive only when people like you keep them alive. If you believe this harvest is more than food, if you believe it is the beginning of Africa's rise, then type New Africa in the comments below and let the world know you are part of the story.